My name is Nicole Bailey, and I was 33 when a photo meant for my husband landed on my phone instead. It was a sonogram. Twins. And the caption underneath it, from my younger sister Brooke, read, "Can't wait to tell everyone they're yours." For 8 years I had believed I was the reason Charles and I had no children. For 8 years I had apologized to my own body. I read that message standing in my kitchen, and I did not cry, and I did not call anyone. I signed the divorce papers 3 days later without saying a single word to him about the photo. He thought that was the end of it. He thought I had simply given up. But while I was sorting our finances for the divorce, I opened an envelope his mother had asked us to keep safe years ago, and what was inside it changed who owed whom an apology. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, the channel where quiet people stop swallowing the blame and start reading the fine print. If you have ever carried a shame that was never yours to carry, stay with me. Drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. Because the truth I found was 17 years old, and it had my husband's name on it, not mine. Let me take you back to the kitchen, because the details matter. It was a Tuesday. I had just come home from a long day auditing a company's books, which is what I do. I am a forensic accountant, which means I am paid to find the truth people bury inside numbers. My phone buzzed with a photo, and I assumed it was a work file. It was a black and white ultrasound image, two little shapes side by side, and my sister's name at the top of the thread. Brooke had meant to send it to Charles. She sent it to me by mistake, the way people do when they are juggling too many secret conversations at once. Can't wait to tell everyone they're yours. Yours. My husband's. My sister's twins. I stood very still and let the whole architecture of the last year reassemble itself in my head. The late meetings, the phone he started carrying to the bathroom, the weekend Brooke suddenly could not make our mother's birthday. I did not feel the floor tilt. I felt it go flat and cold and very clear, the way a spreadsheet goes clear when the fraud finally lines up in a column. I am good at that particular kind of calm. It is the calm of a person who has learned that the loudest reaction is rarely the strongest one. I put the phone face down on the counter. I made myself a cup of tea I did not drink. And somewhere under the shock, a quieter thought was already forming, the thought that would carry me through everything that came next. For 8 years, this family had told me the emptiness in our marriage was my fault. And now my sister was pregnant with twins, and I found, sitting there, that I believed that a great deal less than I had an hour before. You have to understand what 8 years of trying does to a woman who is told the failure is hers. It is not one big grief. It is 1,000 small ones. It is the pharmacy runs for ovulation strips. It is the calendar you stop showing people. It is the way your body becomes a project with a deadline that keeps moving. And it is the apologizing, the endless quiet apologizing, to your husband, to his mother, to yourself, for a thing you cannot control and cannot fix. Charles and I married when I was 24. By 26 we were trying. By 28 we were concerned. By 30 I had a folder, because I am the kind of person who keeps a folder, full of charts and clinic printouts and dates. And through all of it, the story the family told never changed. It was me. It had to be me. Charles was healthy. Charles was fine. Charles came from a family that had babies easily. Look at his cousins. Look at his mother's line. The problem, by process of family elimination, was Nicole. I want to be honest that for a long time I believed it, and belief like that does something to how you stand in a room. You get smaller. You defer. You accept that you are the one who broke the promise, so you owe everyone a little more patience, a little more forgiveness, a little more of yourself. I had been paying that debt for 8 years. I had built a whole marriage around the assumption that I was the one who had failed, and I had never once questioned the one thing the family had made sure I would never question, which was Charles. Here is the part that matters, because I know some of you are already wondering why a careful woman never checked. I did check. Early, at year 2, I did every test they offered. Blood work, ultrasounds, the dye study, all of it. My results came back normal. Not borderline. Normal. And I remember sitting in that clinic with the printout, feeling the first flicker of a reasonable question. If I am fine, shouldn't we test him? So I asked Charles to get tested. I asked kindly, then I asked plainly, then I asked more than once. And every single time, the request hit a wall I could not climb. Charles would get quiet and wounded, as if I had accused him of something. And then his mother, Vivian, would appear in the conversation, on the phone, at Sunday dinner, always with the same soft, absolute certainty. She would say Charles was under a lot of stress. She would say these things take time, that I should be patient, that it was in God's hands. She would say, gently, that my numbers from the clinic were probably just off. And when I pushed, she would look at me with real hurt and ask why I was trying to blame her son. So the test never happened, not because I did not try, but because a wife cannot strap her husband to a chair, and because a mother-in-law had built a wall of shame and faith around the one door that led to the truth. I told myself I was respecting my husband. I know now I was being managed. There is a difference between choosing not to look and being steered, expertly, away from the only place where the answer was ever hiding. I confronted Charles that night, and I did it the way I do everything, without raising my voice. I put my phone on the kitchen table, the sonogram facing up, Brooke's caption visible, and I asked him one thing. I asked if it was true. He looked at the screen, and his whole body sagged, and he did not deny it. That was the answer. He started talking fast, the way guilty men do, about how it just happened, about how lonely the trying had made him, about how Brooke had been there for him. He said my sister's name like it was a comfort and not a knife. And then, because Charles has never in his life been able to sit inside his own fault, he found a way to make even this about my failure. He said quietly that maybe if we had been able to have our own children, none of this would have happened. He said it like an explanation. He said it like I had driven him to my sister's bed by failing to conceive. I looked at my husband of 9 years, the father of my sister's twins, and I understood that he genuinely believed the empty nursery was my doing, and that this belief had become his permission slip for everything. I did not argue. Arguing with a man who has decided you are the reason for his sins is a way of agreeing to the premise. Instead, I said, evenly, that I would be filing for divorce, and I went to bed in the guest room, and I lay awake not with grief, but with the strangest sensation. Like a splinter I had carried for 8 years had shifted, just slightly, and I could suddenly feel exactly where it was. The family closed ranks within a week, and their refrain never changed, even now. My mother-in-law called me, and instead of horror at what her son had done, she had a kind of weary disappointment aimed at me. She said these things happen in marriages that are missing something, she said, and I will remember the exact shape of it forever. It's obviously you, Nicole. Obviously me. Even now. Even with my sister carrying twins that were supposedly her sons, the missing something was still, obviously, me. Brooke did not call at all. Charles asked me to keep things civil and quiet, for the family's sake, which I would later understand meant for his sake, and I did the thing that surprised all of them. I signed the divorce papers without a fight. No screaming, no scene, no long negotiation. I had my lawyer draw them up clean and fair, and I signed my name, Nicole Bailey, reaching back for the maiden name I had set down at 24, and I said almost nothing to any of them. They took my silence for defeat. They thought the quiet accountant had folded, that I was too broken or too proud to make trouble. What none of them knew was that quiet is not the same as finished. I was not grieving my marriage into silence. I was doing what I do best. I was gathering the records, sorting the assets, following the paper, the same way I follow it when a company swears its books are clean. And somewhere in those boxes, in an envelope I had carried through 2 moves without ever opening, the truth of the last 8 years was sitting in the dark, waiting for a forensic accountant to finally do her job on her own life. I moved into a small rental across town, and I turned the divorce into a project, because a project is how I survive things that would otherwise swallow me. When a marriage ends, someone has to divide the paper, the accounts, the deeds, the policies, the boxes of documents a couple accumulates over 9 years without noticing. Charles, true to form, wanted nothing to do with the boring part. He was busy being a father-to-be. So the entire archive of our shared life came with me to the rental, stacked in the spare room, and I started doing to it exactly what I do to a suspect company's records. I sorted by category. I built a timeline. I flagged anything that did not fit. It was slow, careful work, and it was the only thing that made me feel like myself again, because for 8 years I had let this family tell me who I was, and a spreadsheet never lies to you about your worth. Most of it was ordinary. Mortgage papers, tax returns, the warranty for a dishwasher we no longer owned together. But in the back of the closet, under the tax boxes, was a box I had not packed and did not recognize at first. It was older than our marriage, and when I looked closer, I saw the handwriting on the lid, and my stomach did something small and cold. It was Vivian's handwriting. It was a box my mother-in-law had given us years ago, early in the marriage, asking us to keep Charles's important papers safe because her house had a leak. I had shoved it in a closet and forgotten it existed. I pulled it out into the light and sat down on the floor of my rental and opened it. Before I tell you what was in that box, I have to tell you about Brooke, because you need to understand what my sister actually wanted. Brooke is 4 years younger than me, and for our whole lives she has measured herself against me and come away angry about the result. I was the steady one, the one with the degree and the career and the marriage into a family with money. Brooke was the one who never quite landed, who borrowed and drifted and resented. And Charles's family had money, real money, an old house and a trust, and the kind of quiet wealth that photographs well at Christmas. About a week after I moved out, Brooke sent me a message. Not an apology, a performance. She wrote about how excited the Bennetts were, how Vivian was already redecorating a nursery, how the twins would want for nothing. She was not writing to hurt me, exactly. She was writing to show me that she had won the thing she thought I had. The family, the security, the place at the table, and that she had gotten it by taking my husband and my supposed failure and turning both into her jackpot. I read that message, and I understood my sister completely. Maybe for the first time. She had not fallen into an affair. She had climbed into one. She had looked at my life, decided the barren wife was the weak point in the Bennett fortune, and moved in. The twins were not an accident of love. They were, in Brooke's mind, an air-shaped key to a vault. I filed that understanding away, calm as ever. Because if the twins were a key to the Bennett fortune, then whether they were actually Charles's was suddenly the most important question in the world. Vivian called me again while I was still sitting with that box unopened in my lap, as if she could sense I was getting close to something. My mother-in-law has always had a talent for appearing at the exact moment you might see too much. Her voice was warm and sorrowful and completely certain, the way it had been for 8 years. She said she hoped I would not make things ugly. She said the family had been through enough. She said, and here the old script ran one more time, that she knew this was hard for me because of my situation, meaning my empty womb, meaning my failure, meaning the thing she had spent 8 years making sure I believed. And then she asked me gently to come to a family dinner in a few weeks, to make peace, to show everyone there were no hard feelings before the babies came. I said I would think about it. I kept my voice soft and small, the voice she expected, the defeated voice, because I had learned something in 8 years of being managed. The best way to be underestimated is to sound exactly as beaten as they need you to be. She said she was glad I was being mature about it. She said Charles deserved happiness. She said one more time that none of this would have happened if things had been different, and we both knew what different meant. I said, I understand, Vivian. And I did understand, finally, more than she could imagine. I hung up. I looked down at the box with her handwriting on the lid, the box of Charles's important papers she had asked me to keep safe. and I lifted off the top. The box was mostly what she had said it was. Charles's old papers, the archaeology of a life before me, his high school diploma, a college transcript, vaccination records, insurance paperwork from when he was still on his parents' policy, photographs of a boy I had never met, gap-toothed and squinting on a beach. I went through it the way I go through everything, slowly, in order, making a mental index. And then, near the bottom, I found a manila envelope, sealed, older than the rest, with writing on the front in Vivian's careful hand. It did not say anything dramatic. It said simply, Charles, medical, private. My whole career is built on a single instinct, and that instinct woke up the moment I saw that envelope. When someone labels one document private inside a box of documents that are already private, they are not organizing, they are hiding. A thing labeled private in a private box is a thing meant never to be opened, and the fact that it existed at all, that Vivian had handed it to us to keep safe, and trusted that I would never look, told me she had done something she needed, kept close but out of her own house. I held it for a long moment. I want to be honest about that moment, because I almost did not open it. Part of me was tired, and part of me still, after everything, felt the old training that said Charles's business was not mine to see. Then I remembered the sonogram. I remembered 8 years of obviously you, and I remembered that I am, above everything, a person whose job is to open the envelope everyone is hoping stays sealed. So I did. Before I tell you what was inside, I called Dana, because even in the worst moment my training holds, and my training says, you do not act on a single document until you understand it. Dana is my closest friend and a fellow accountant, the person I call when a case gets personal and I need someone to keep me honest. I told her what I had found, my voice steadier than I felt. And Dana, bless her, did not gasp or celebrate. She asked me the right questions, the cold, clean questions that are a kind of love in our profession. Are the dates consistent? Is there a provider name you can verify? Is there a second document that corroborates the first? Does anything about it look altered or out of place? She reminded me that a forensic finding is only as strong as its authentication, that a single letter proves nothing until you can tie it to a real institution, a real date, a real chain. She told me not to build my whole life on one piece of paper until I had made that piece of paper survive scrutiny. It was exactly what I needed to hear, because the thing in my hands was so enormous that I was afraid to trust it. So I did not let myself feel it yet. I treated my own marriage like a case file. I laid the document flat under good light. I got out my phone to photograph it for the record, and I started doing the boring, methodical work of confirming whether the sentence that was about to detonate 8 years of my life was actually, provably, true. Because if it was, I was not going to hand anyone a chance to call it a mistake. Inside the envelope were 2 documents, and I have both of them still, in a safe deposit box, because they are the most important papers I have ever held. The first was a letter from a urology clinic on real letterhead, dated 17 years ago, when Charles was 19, years before he ever met me. It was a diagnosis summary. It used a word I had to read twice, then a third time, the word spinning the whole world around a new center, azoospermia. The permanent kind, the letter said, following an illness in his teens, a bad case of mumps that had settled where it does the most quiet damage. In plain language, the letter said that Charles produced no viable sperm, that the condition was not treatable, and that he should be counseled about his options for a family. The second document was an insurance explanation of benefits, from the same clinic, the same span of dates, the billing codes matching the diagnosis, the charges paid on his parents' policy. 2 independent papers, the clinical letter and the financial record, telling the identical story with the cold agreement of real evidence. Charles had been infertile since he was 19. Not me. Him. Before we ever met, before our first date, before every apology I made to my own body, before 8 years of obviously you, The answer had been sitting in a sealed envelope his mother handed me to keep safe, betting that the barren, dutiful wife would never think to look inside. I sat on the floor of my rental for a long time. I did not cry, and then I did. And then I stopped, and something underneath the crying went very quiet and very strong. I photographed both pages. I put the originals somewhere safe. And I understood that I was no longer holding my grief. I was holding my proof. I need you to sit with the two things that letter meant because they are separate, and each one is enormous. The first is about me. For 8 years, I had carried a shame that was medically impossible for me to deserve. Every ovulation strip, every clinic visit, every "be patient, Nicole." Every night I lay awake wondering what was wrong with me. All of it had been built on a lie that a mother told to protect her son, and that a son told to protect his ego. My body had never been the problem. It had been fine the whole time. The failure they hung around my neck for 8 years belonged to Charles, and Vivian had known it since he was 19, and she had watched me apologize for it at her dinner table year after year and said nothing, and instead said, "Obviously, you." The second thing that letter meant was about the twins, because a zoospermia does not bend. A man who produces no viable sperm cannot father a child, and he certainly cannot father two. Which meant the sonogram on my phone, my sister's twins, the babies Brooke was calling Charles's, the heirs to the Bennett fortune, could not possibly be his. Not improbably. Not unlikely. Could not. My sister was pregnant by someone else, and she was telling my husband and his wealthy family that the babies were his, and she was doing it to secure a place in a fortune. And Charles, who did not know he was sterile because his own mother had hidden it from him, believed her. I sat there and let the whole machine assemble itself in my head, every gear meshing, the way a fraud finally resolves into a single clean picture. And I realized I was the only person alive holding all the pieces. I spent the next several days doing what Dana told me to do, turning a devastating letter into unshakable proof, because I was not going to walk into that family holding something anyone could wave away. I confirmed the clinic still existed under a successor practice. I matched the letterhead and the physician's name to public licensing records from that era, and they were real. I cross-checked the dates on the diagnosis against the insurance explanation of benefits, and they lined up to the month. I even, carefully, did the human verification, the kind that does not show up in a file. I remembered that at holidays, Charles's Aunt Peg sometimes told stories about him as a boy, and one of those stories, told fondly 100 times, was about the terrible spring Charles was 15 or 16 and so sick with the mumps the doctors were worried. I had heard that story for years without hearing it. Now it was corroboration. A family that openly remembered a teenage illness serious enough to frighten his doctors, sitting right next to a clinical diagnosis of the exact complication that illness causes. The pieces did not just fit. They were the same piece, seen from two directions. By the end of the week, I was as certain of Charles's infertility as I have ever been of anything in a case file. More certain, because I had the clinical record, the financial record, and the living family memory, 3 independent sources telling one story. I was not guessing. I was not accusing out of hurt. I was holding a fact. And a forensic accountant with a fact, and the patience to wait for the right room, is a very dangerous thing to have underestimated for 8 years. Once I was sure of the medicine, I did what I always do next. I followed the money, because betrayals in families almost always have a bank account underneath them. Brooke had not chosen Charles at random. She had chosen a Bennett, and the Bennett family had exactly the kind of wealth that makes a paternity claim worth manufacturing. An old family trust, a paid-off house, and a matriarch who had wanted grandchildren so badly for so long that she would forgive almost anything from the person who finally provided them. I thought about the timeline. Brooke had drifted into Charles's life right as my marriage was visibly cracking. She had gotten pregnant fast with twins, doubling the emotional jackpot, and she had immediately framed the babies as Bennett heirs. If those babies were accepted as Charles's, Brooke went from my drifting, resentful little sister to the mother of the only grandchildren in a wealthy family, with a claim on its future and a permanent seat at its table. That was the prize. That was always the prize. The affair was the method. The fortune was the motive. And the entire scheme rested on one assumption that my sister did not know was false, the assumption everyone in that family shared, that Charles could father children. Only two people on Earth knew that assumption was a lie. One was Vivian, who had hidden it for 17 years. The other now was me. Brooke had built her whole future on a foundation that a single sealed envelope turned to sand. She just did not know the envelope had been opened, and I was not going to tell her, or Charles, or Vivian, 1 second before the moment it would do the most complete and undeniable good. Charles came to my rental once during those weeks, uninvited, to ask me to keep things quiet. He stood in my little doorway looking like a man who had gotten everything he wanted and could not understand why it felt like standing on ice. He asked me, almost tenderly, not to poison the family against him and Brooke. He said the babies deserved a clean start. He said he knew I was hurt, but that dragging things out would only make me look bitter. And then, because Charles cannot help himself, he offered me a kindness that was really one last insult. He said that maybe, once the dust settled, I would find someone who could give me what he couldn't. He meant a child. He meant that I was still, in his mind, the broken one, the one who could not conceive, and that my future was defined by that lack. He said it to my face, weeks after I had read his diagnosis, and he had no idea that I knew. No idea that every soft cruelty he handed me was landing on a woman, holding the proof of exactly whose body had failed whom. I looked at my husband and I felt something I had not expected. Not rage, something closer to pity, cold and clean. I said, "I hope the babies are healthy, Charles," which was true, and which he took as surrender, and which was the most honest and the most loaded thing I could have said, because I was the only one in that doorway who knew those babies would eventually raise a question no one in his family was ready to answer. He left thinking he had won. I let him. Momentum was on my side now, and I did not want to slow it down. The invitation came, as I knew it would, framed as mercy. Vivian called to tell me the family was having a dinner to welcome the babies, a celebration, and that she wanted me there to close this chapter gracefully. Charles, she said, was going to make it official in front of everyone, announce the pregnancy as a joyful new beginning for the whole family. She framed my invitation as generosity, a chance for the discarded wife to show she bore no grudge, to bless the union that had replaced her. I understood exactly what the dinner was. It was a coronation. It was the night Brooke would be formally installed as the mother of the Bennett heirs, the night Charles would step into fatherhood in front of every relative who mattered, the night the family narrative, the one where I was the barren failure and Brooke was the miracle, would be set in stone with a toast. They wanted me there to complete the picture, the gracious loser at the far end of the table, proof that everyone was being very civilized about it. And I said yes. I said yes calmly, gratefully, in my small, defeated voice. And Vivian told me she was proud of me, and I thanked her, because they had just handed me the one thing I had been waiting for. A room, a public room, full of the whole family, on the exact night they intended to make the lie permanent. For 8 years, these people had built their story about me in private, in phone calls and dinners and soft certain sentences no one else could hear. Now they were going to gather every witness in one place, and I was going to bring the fine print. I made myself decide, clearly and on purpose, what I was and was not going to do at that dinner, because a plan is the only thing that keeps a person calm when the stakes are this high. I was not going to scream. I was not going to throw the sonogram back in Brooke's face, or call Charles names, or give Vivian the ugly scene she could later use to recast me as unhinged. Every one of those things would have felt good for a moment and lost me the war. A woman who yells at a celebration becomes the villain of the story, no matter what she is holding. What I was going to do was much quieter and much worse for them. I was going to let the dinner happen. I was going to let Charles stand up and make his announcement, let him toast his impossible fatherhood in front of everyone he wanted to impress. And then, when the moment was at its highest, I was going to set one envelope on the table and ask one calm question, and I was going to let the truth do to that room what truth does. I did not need to attack anyone. The document attacked for me. It is the great advantage of holding a fact instead of an accusation. You never have to raise your voice, because the facts are already screaming, and everyone in the room hears them at the same time. I chose the copy I would bring, not the originals. Those stayed locked away. I chose the words for my one question, and I chose, above all, to stay calm. Because the calmer I was, the louder the paper would be. I want to say something to you directly, because I know some of you are carrying a blame that was handed to you by someone who knew better. Your worth is not a verdict other people get to reach about you. Sometimes the kindest, strongest thing you can do is stop accepting a story about yourself and go find the evidence. You are allowed to check. You are allowed to open the envelope. If this is reaching something real in you, subscribe and stay with me, because the dinner is where it all comes due. Dana came over the night before to help me get ready, and she treated it exactly like prepping for court, which is exactly what it was. We made a clean copy of the diagnosis letter and the insurance record, stapled in a plain envelope, nothing dramatic. We laid out my divorce decree beside it, finalized now, my maiden name printed at the top, Nicole Bailey, a woman legally separate from the man whose secret I was carrying. Dana ran me through the plan like a checklist. Stay calm. Let Charles finish his announcement. Don't interrupt the toast. Let him climb all the way out onto the branch. Then, one document, one question, no adjectives. She made me practice the question until my voice was flat and even and impossible to read as anything but a simple request for information. She reminded me not to explain, not to argue, not to fill the silence after, because the silence would do more than any speech I could give. And then Dana, who has known me for a decade, put her hand on mine and said the thing I actually needed. She said, "Nicole, whatever happens in that room, you already have the only thing that matters. You know the truth now. You are not the broken one. You never were." I sat with that. For 8 years, I had walked into that family's houses feeling like the person who owed everyone an explanation. Tomorrow I would walk in for the last time knowing I was the only person there who had never had anything to apologize for. I slept, and I slept well. And in the morning, I put on a plain dark dress and drove to Vivian's house one final time. Vivian's dining room was set the way she sets it for the moments that matter to her, the good china, the candles, the flowers, the whole family gathered to witness whatever she has decided is important. I counted the room as I came in, the way I count everything. Charles at the head, glowing, nervous. Brooke beside him, one hand resting on the small curve of her stomach, radiant and triumphant, wearing her pregnancy like a crown she had stolen and had resized to fit. Vivian orchestrating, refilling glasses, steering the evening toward the announcement she had planned. Aunt Peg, kind and a little confused, near the end of the table. A scattering of cousins and relatives, the witnesses Vivian had assembled to make the new story official, and me, seated exactly where they wanted me, at the far end, the gracious former wife. Proof of how civilized everyone was being. They had given me the loser's chair. They did not know it was the best seat in the house. I was polite. I complimented the food. I asked Brooke how she was feeling and meant something completely different than she heard. I let them relax. Let them believe the quiet accountant had truly come to bless the whole arrangement, because the more comfortable they were, the further Charles would climb before the branch broke. Vivian caught my eye once across the table and gave me a small, satisfied nod, the nod of a woman who believes she has managed the last loose end of a difficult situation. I nodded back. The envelope was in my bag on the floor by my chair. My hand was steady. And I waited, calm as still water, for my husband to stand up and toast a fatherhood that was medically impossible. Charles stood up between the main course and dessert, and the table quieted, and my mother-in-law folded her hands like a woman about to receive a blessing she had earned. He was nervous in the way of a man who has rehearsed. He thanked everyone for coming. He said the past year had been hard for the family, with a small apologetic glance down the table at me, casting himself as the brave one moving forward through pain. And then he said it. He said that he and Brooke were expecting twins. He said the word twins like it was the sun coming up, and the table gasped and cooed on cue, because most of them were hearing it confirmed for the first time. Vivian pressed a hand to her chest, eyes wet. 17 years of wanting grandchildren finally answered. Brooke looked down at her stomach with a practiced, glowing modesty. And Charles raised his glass, and his voice caught. And he said he had waited his whole life to become a father, that after everything, he was finally going to be a dad. He toasted to the twins. He toasted, God help him, to finally becoming the father I always wanted to be. Glasses lifted around the table. Aunt Peg dabbed her eyes. It was the exact coronation Vivian had designed, the moment the new story became permanent, the barren wife replaced by the fertile sister, the family made whole again on a foundation of one hidden letter. I let the toast complete. I let the glasses touch. I let Charles have the full, whole, undiluted top of his moment, because I am not cruel, and I did not want to interrupt, and because a thing is so much heavier when it falls from the very top. Then, into the warm applause, I picked up my glass, and I stood. I want you to know that I meant the first thing I said. I raised my glass toward Charles and Brooke, and in a calm, clear voice I said, Congratulations, truly. I hope those babies are loved every day of their lives. The table softened, charmed, relieved. The gracious former wife had given her blessing after all. Vivian actually smiled at me, and then, while the goodwill was still in the air, I set my glass down, and I reached into my bag, and I took out the plain envelope, and I laid it flat on the white tablecloth in front of me. I did not raise my voice. I looked at Charles, and I asked him my one question, the one Dana and I had practiced until it was smooth as glass. Charles, I said, do you remember being 19? The spring you were so sick? Your mother does. There's a letter about it. The room did not understand yet, but Charles's face changed, and more importantly, Vivian's did. I kept my eyes on Charles, gentle, almost kind. You've spent 8 years letting everyone believe our marriage had no children because of me, I said. I believed it too, until I found what your mother asked us to keep safe. I slid the envelope an inch toward the center of the table. It's a diagnosis, Charles, from a urologist, dated 17 years ago, before you ever met me. I let that sit. You should know what it says before you toast to being a father. I did not touch it again. I did not explain further. I simply sat back down, folded my hands, and let the envelope lie there in the candlelight, a small white rectangle that had just, very quietly, stopped a coronation. And every eye in the room went from my calm face to that envelope to Vivian, who had gone the color of the tablecloth. Vivian broke first, because a secret is heaviest for the person who has carried it longest. She was staring at the envelope like it was a living thing. Charles reached for it, confused, half laughing, telling me to stop being dramatic, and his hand actually froze in the air when his mother made a sound. It was small and involuntary and awful. And then Vivian, my composed, orchestrating mother-in-law, the woman who had said obviously you to my face for 8 years, looked at her son with pure panic and whispered the sentence that ended everything. Wait. Her voice shook. She never told you the truth? The table went utterly silent. Charles turned to his mother, the glass still in his hand, the toast still warm in the air. Told me what? He said. And Vivian could not answer, because there was no version of the answer that did not destroy her, and her silence was louder than any confession. Charles picked up the envelope with a hand that was no longer steady. He opened it. I watched my husband read the letter I had read on the floor of my rental, watched his eyes go down the page and stop on the word, The same word that had spun my world. Azoospermia. Permanent. Dated to when he was 19. I watched him read that he had been infertile since before we met. I watched him understand, in front of his entire family, that he could not have children, that he never could have, that the 8 years he had spent blaming me and the affair he had justified with my supposed barrenness had all been built on a lie his own mother had told him and everyone else. And then I watched the second understanding arrive, the one that hit even harder, as his eyes lifted slowly from the page and turned, with dawning horror, toward Brooke. You could see the arithmetic move through the room, person by person, the way a light comes on in one window and then the next. If Charles had been infertile since he was 19, then Charles could not be the father of anyone's twins. And if he could not be the father, then the babies Brooke was carrying, the babies she had spent months calling his, the heirs this whole dinner was built to celebrate, belonged to someone else. Brooke's face was the first to break. She started shaking her head, fast, saying the letter had to be wrong, old, a mistake, that doctors got things wrong all the time. But I had done my work, and I said, still calm, still seated. It's confirmed by the insurance records from the same clinic, and by the fact that your whole family remembers how sick he was that year. That was